as I mentioned, I want to show you doing the same case, only now I'm going to do it in advanced mode. Now, first of all, why would you want to use advanced mode? Because by using a wizard, what it's doing is it's dumbing it down enough that it makes it very, very easy. Blue Sky Plan's a huge program, right? There's tons of features, and it can be very intimidating and confusing for a new user. But as you start progressing with your skill in designing cases, you're probably going to want to tackle, more complex cases. And so we'll try to maybe do something to make this a little bit more difficult and do some features that you probably couldn't do in the wizard mode. All right, so we're back to the basic open window of Blue Sky Plan. Once again, we'll click Implant Planning and Surgical Guides. However, if you want to work in the more advanced mode, you could click here on just import the patient CT scan. All right. We're going to do the same case. This is case 1 DICOM. I'll click OK. And you'll see lots of similarities. The biggest difference when you're working in advanced mode is you're going to do all the same steps. It's just not going to automatically prompt you to do them. You've got to know this is the route that I want to go. Once again, when you get to this screen, you can limit your field of view, right? I don't need to, see the eye socket and the spine. So I'm going to reduce the amount of data that the computer is going to have to crunch, and that will make this thing run smoother. I'll click OK. And now it does automatically prompt you for this, because again, there's two pieces of data we have to have in any case, right? Regardless how complex or simple. And we've got to have cone beam data. We've opened that, but we've also got to bring in our STL model. So again, for 95% of cases, you've probably got an STL from either an intraoral scanner or a desktop scanner. So we're just going to click on import an STL model. Once again, we're going to look for case 1 gingiva. All right, you can see it right here. We'll click OK. And once again, it is going to prompt you to automatically stitch this. So let's go ahead and click on mandible. I'll click OK. And the auto stitching feature is going to take over. It's going to automatically stitch this to the cone beam data. It prompts you right here, hey, make sure your alignment is correct. Okay. So again, this is a different view than what we had in the wizard, right? We are currently in Model Master, so that's where it's going to default you at the beginning. And Model Master is where you can do a lot of your alignment, you can edit your model, you can do all kinds of manual things here, but that's where we are currently. Now, if I want to verify my stitch, there's two windows that I'm always going to do that in. They were already visible in your wizard. Here, we've got a little different layout. There's going to be 5 windows. This is your cross section, right? This is going to scroll through. You can see there's a blue, yellow, red outline that corresponds to the blue, yellow, red lines. These are 1 millimeter apart in your pano view. So as I scroll through this, and let's maximize it, I'm scrolling through and I can see I've got really tight adaptation of that model outline to my cone beam data. That's what I want to see. All right, if I minimize that, the other window that we can look in is this axial slice. So in particular, I want to scroll up and down through the cusp tips on this. And the deeper you go, you'll see that you start to deviate away from the teeth. That's because there's gingiva on this STL. So it's only useful up here on the teeth themselves. And I can see I've got great adaptation. This looks like a good stitch. All right, so let's go through one more time, just basic mouse functionality. If you are in this 3D window, right, holding the left mouse button is going to spin this thing around. I can spin it wherever I want. If I hold down the right mouse button, that is going to be zoom. And if I hold down the right and left mouse button, that is bodily movement. All right, and you've got to be able to use all 3 of those features. If I was trying to zoom in and see my edentulous site, for example, I need to be able to spin it to the view I want, to zoom in to the degree I want, and then get it centered in my screen too, right? If it was over here, then as I zoom in, it goes out of screen. I've got to be able to pull that over, so that's right and left. Again, you've got the same features in all of the other windows. If I'm hovering in the axial slice and I hold down the right mouse, that is zoom. If I hold right and left mouse, that is bodily movement. And then the only difference here between the 3D windows, and this applies to all of them, if I just left click somewhere, it's not going to spin this because these are not 3D windows, right? What it's going to do though is it's going to center your views wherever it is you clicked. So again, if I wanted to go directly to my edentulous site, I could click in any window, but here I'll do the pan window. Click there, you can see that everything jumps over to that site, and then I could play with any of the views that I want to. Once again, your green window is your tangential window, and everything is color coordinated here. You see the green outline right now, it looks just like a cross section like over here, but if I hover here and scroll, that spins a tangent to the cross section. So now I'm looking at it from a buckle view. All right. And then the final thing that you need to do now, usually it's going to default to the correct view. Here I can see everything in the arch, right? On occasion you might notice that, you know, the panoramic window is cutting off, say, the third molars or something, and you know that those were captured in your cone beam. Well, you need to know that everything in these views is determined by this panoramic curve. All right, so if you're looking in this axial window, the yellow trough that you see here, that is your panoramic curve. And so first of all, every time you start a case, you want to set your panoramic curve. So I like to drag the last node. Let me zoom in and show you. You'll see within this trough are these individual nodes that I can grab with the left mouse click and reposition. All right. And so if they weren't tracking along the jaw perfectly, then you could reposition those wherever you want them. Again, usually this is done automatically, but if you grab the last node, that is going to stretch the curve, and sometimes you will have to do that. You'll see that the curve maybe is cutting off third molars, and I like to see all of that. Now your other thing is, I'm going to grab this corner node and make this kind of skinny. So do you notice how all of these cross-sectional windows and this axial window are now, you know, very skinny? They're cutting off certain areas. Like right here, you can see that it's cutting off this portion of the mandible. Now, why is that? Well, because my panoramic trough is very skinny. So if you zoom in here, and if you just left click on one of these corner yellow nodes and pull outward, right, what that's going to do is widen your panoramic trough. And I generally want to get it fairly wide, about like you see right here in my axial window, because that's going to give me a full view of the arch that I'm working on. And so just make sure that you set your view. If things don't look right, it's probably a function of this curve not being set correctly. So those are just things to check when you first open a case. All right. So from here, I've given you a little cheat sheet that I want you to look at. All right. These are the steps that I follow pretty much every single time I'm doing a guided surgery case. I'm always going to open the DICOM and limit my field of view. I'm always going to import and stitch the STL. I'm going to set their panoramic curve. I'm going to map the nerve, then I'll plan a tooth, then I'll go to advanced mode, plan the implant, choose the kit, turn on the guide tube, draw the guide curve, add seating windows, and then create the guide. And then finally I'll export and save the guide, create a drill report, save the case. So you notice that it's all of the same steps that we did in the wizard mode, but again, the challenge for people in advanced mode is it's not intuitive to them that they need to follow this process. And you could do these in different orders, but I find that this is the best way to approach a case. This is how I do every single case when I do it. So I'll try to throw this up throughout the process when we start a step, and if you'll just get in the habit of always approaching the case this way, that will ensure that you don't miss anything and that your case comes out the way you want it to. All right, so we've set the panoramic curve, we know our mouse functionality, we know all of that stuff. We've got our DICOM, everything is ready to go, and now we need to go ahead and start working on the case. So being that this is a mandibular case, right, the first thing that we need to do is map the nerve. So I'm going to come up here, and at the very top, remember it's not automatically prompting me, but you see at the top window here there's a button that says add nerve. It looks like a little jaw with a nerve in it with a plus sign. Click on that, and that's going to bring up your nerve list panel. Now I should mention too, everything in Blue Sky Plan works off of these panels. You could see what panels are available if you come up here to the top menu bar, and under panels you see that there's nerve list, implant list, model manipulation. There's all kinds of panels available to you here. And I could just as easily get to this window by clicking in the nerve list panel up here, but it's easiest just to click on the nerve with the plus sign. And once again, you've got automatic nerve detection functionality. If you want to use that, you can just click auto detect nerves. So let's click that. And just like in the wizard, it's going to auto detect these nerves and map them in, but then we'll have the opportunity to edit them. All right, so as with all the automated steps, once you check them, or once you have done them, always go back and check them. Make sure that they're going where they should be. So I can go up here to my cross-sectional window, and once again, scrolling through, I'm looking, everything seems to be tracking along perfectly. But if I see that it's off somewhere, anytime I come across one of these white nodes, I could grab that node and reposition it. Okay, you'll also see those down here, right? If I was to grab one of these nodes, that can be repositioned. All right, but again, this function is going to work 98% of the time. The only time it might fail is if for whatever reason you had a ton of scatter from metal plates in the jaw, or tons and tons of implants, or the most common one is sometimes patients will have, I call it hollow mandible syndrome, where they've got this dense cortex, but the inside of the mandible just has no trabeculation to the bone, and it just looks all like hollow space, right? Well, if that's the case, it's all soft tissue in there, and it can't distinguish the nerve from the rest of the marrow and soft tissue. And so those can be challenging cases. Thankfully, that's not a really common thing, but look this over. If it doesn't look right, really scrutinize it. You do have manual functions to map the nerve, right? Those are in previous videos I've done, so I'm not going to belabor that point. But let's say that I've looked this over, I think it's correct, then I want to go ahead and lock my nerve. So while we're in this panel, right, I click this padlock. I could either click them individually, or if I just click on the lock, that will lock my nerves. Now, one other thing, you can change the color. If I click on the color swatch, I could make this nerve be red. Okay. I could also change the diameter of the nerve. So if, say, I was looking right here and it looks like it's in the correct position, but I feel like the canal is bigger than what's being shown there, well, I can change the diameter of the nerve. Okay, so make sure that that nerve is correct. Once you like everything, go ahead and click the padlock. So let's minimize this, get back to our original view. All right, now I would suggest at this point, you've got your STL model stitched. The next thing we're going to need to do is to plan a tooth. But as you might imagine, looking at this view, when I plan the tooth, I've kind of got all of this, skull and the opposing arch in the way. This really isn't serving me once I'm at this point in the case. So what I like to do, and I would suggest you do, is turn off this 3D rendering of the cone beam data. We need to see the cone beam data in the 2D views, not in this 3D window. So how do we do that? If you go to Panels and click on Surfaces panel, you're going to see that this new panel comes up, and this is where you can control all of the surfaces within the case. So up here you see that we've got this case 1 gingiva. That's the STL model that we pulled in. If I want to change the color, I can do that here, right? So you can change the color. Looking at the model outlines, let me show you this. So you see the blue outline here for my STL model. Let's say that I didn't see that and I want to see it, or maybe I want to turn it off. That is this feature right here called hint. So when I uncheck the hint, you see that outline goes away. Now generally you do want that on. And then you've also got the visibility of the STL model. So notice right here, when I check visible, it turns on and off. So you generally want that visible. All right, now where I would turn off this 3D rendering is right here. So that's STL surfaces. This is CT surfaces. Let's uncheck visible. And now you can see that's a much cleaner view. That's going to allow us to plan the tooth and everything without that opposing arch and the bone in our way. So I would always suggest when you get to this point in the case, go ahead and uncheck visible on your CT surface. And then you've got other features here, just so you can see it. You've got cutting features, you've got isolate features, right? Let's suppose that I wanted to get rid of this maxilla. Well, looking around, it's not touching anything with that mandible. So you see the button that says isolate. Let me actually do this. You do need to first tell it what surface you're wanting to do this on. So I want to do this on my CT surface. If I click isolate, now wherever I click next, it's going to isolate anything that is not touching that surface. So I'm going to click the mandible. And you see how the maxilla, the little pieces of the spine and hyoid bone, they all went away, right? Because they were not connected to this surface. So that's a useful feature that you might use sometime. You've also got cutting tools, right? So if by chance I wanted to cut this 3D rendering, when I turn that on, that's going to be a lasso tool that I can use to cut off anything that I'm not wanting to see. So you see that that's cut that off. Now, until I go down here and deactivate this button, it's still just wherever I click next, it's going to want to keep cutting. So when you're done with that, you've got to go and click the cut button again so that it's not highlighted, and now you can do whatever you need to do. So once again, I've unchecked visible here. If we look back at our cheat sheet, the next thing after we planned the nerves is we need to plan a tooth. So just like the nerve, we're going to come up here, and on the top panel there is a add tooth button. Click that, and once again you've got this automated function now. Now I could go in here and select an individual tooth from any number of libraries, right? And that used to be the old way of doing it. Now, unless it's a more complex case, I would just suggest that you use this automatic tooth generation function. So I'm going to click on the lower left first molar, click OK, and now wherever I click next, it's going to drop that tooth. So you want to look at this, grab over here in space where you can rotate this, not on the model, because as soon as you click on the model, that's where it's going to want to drop a tooth. Get this where you're looking down on it, and then just a single left click in the edentulous site. That's going to turn on the automatic tooth generation function. It's going to generate a tooth for us, and that can be our prosthetic wax up that we do our planning from. Alright, so it's planned us a tooth, and just like in the wizard mode, it looks like a great tooth. It just didn't prompt me to do this step, right? I had to go and choose to do this manually. So one of the nice things about the advanced mode is I can jump around, I can go in any order I want, I can do unique things that the wizard won't allow me to do, but I do have to go do them myself, right? It's not going to prompt me to do it automatically. Once again, if you wanted to modify this, if I hover on that tooth, I've got all of the same functions that we had in the wizard mode. I can scoot things around, I could stretch the tooth, make it a little bit bigger. Again, I think this looks great. The only modification I might make is upright that just a little bit and then pull it back over into the center of that edentulous space. But for a single tooth implant case, I really didn't even need to do that. This looks like a great proposal. Alright, so we've got a tooth. So at this point in the case, we're ready to go ahead and plan an implant, right? But looking here, I look up and I want to add an implant. I don't see it here. Why is that? It's because we're still in Model Master module. Alright, Blue Sky Plan works off of different modules. If I click in this upper right corner, that becomes a drop-down menu, and you can see I've got different implant planning modes. I've got crown and bridge mode. I've got denture mode. All right, we want to change over here to surgical guide advanced mode. Don't click normal, because normal is not going to have all of the functions that you're wanting to do if you're trying to have the maximum flexibility. And once you're doing more complex cases, or if you just like to make some little manual edits, I would suggest you just work in advanced mode. Now when I do that, I've got a whole lot more functions up here at the top, right? And now I see an add implant button. So I'm going to go ahead now and add the implant. So when I click this, I can tell it this is a mandible, right? If I left this on maxilla, then when I drop it in, it's going to be upside down, and I could spin it around and that would be okay, but just go ahead and click the jaw orientation that you're working on. I know from planning this previously, this was a 5 by 10 millimeter implant. Okay, so I'm going to choose a 5 by 10. Once again, I like to go ahead and add an abutment, and I go down here to custom abutment, and I'll make it 20 millimeters long by 3 millimeters in diameter. So I'll click OK, and now wherever I click next on any of the windows, that's where it's going to drop the implant. I prefer to do it here in the panoramic window, so I'll click right here on the edentulous site. And now this is where, when you're doing your implant positioning, I would suggest you pretty much do it exclusively in this tangential window. The tangential window is so useful because once you have an implant in the case, if I click on that implant, it has centered the view right on the long axis of that implant, and it will just spin a tangent around that. So here I'm looking at it from a cross-sectional view. I can see the bone outline right here. So I want to be coming right through the occlusal surface. I want to be about 1 millimeter subcrestal. And if I spin now I'm looking at it from a buccal or a lingual view. Remember, you want to parallel the adjacent roots. So I've pretty much got the same long axis as the premolar in front of it. Looks like I'm centered up in the tooth. I like where that screw access hole would be. And once again, if I did this and I wanted to change my implant size, so let's say that we're going to do an 11.5, I can just right click the implant and replace it and choose an 11.5. All right, and it looks like we've got plenty of bone for that. So be really critical of this. When you like it in this view, also look at it in your 3D window, because sometimes looks can be deceiving up here. You want to make sure that you like where your screw access hole is. This is the case. We got tons of bone. We can get perfect position. There's no reason not to have an absolutely perfect screw emergence hole. Now if you had minimal bone, you might have to make some compromises and use a custom abutment or whatever, but it's good to know that by being able to look here. Alright, so we've got the implant positioned, we like where everything is, and now we're ready to begin doing the surgical guide fabrication. Alright, now I mentioned to you that advanced mode gives you more manual functionality. Okay, so before we start making a guide, I'm going to take a slight detour here and give you some examples of a thing that you might need to do in advanced mode. Alright, so let's also, in this case, say that we're going to do an immediate implant. Alright, and we could pick any tooth in the arch here. Let's just pick this, this premolar right here. Alright, and even though that's a healthy tooth, we're going to pretend that we need to do an immediate implant right here. So I can't do this in the wizard mode because I don't have the ability to remove that tooth. Okay, the only way you're going to make a guide for this for an immediate is if we can virtually extract that tooth and then get it out of the way where we can now have a model to build a guide on. So let me give you an example how I would do that. If I go to the surfaces panel, now we've previously opened it. Any panel that you've previously opened is now going to be tabbed over here on your right hand side of the screen. So I would suggest, if you wanted to do an immediate, that you right click on your STL and duplicate it. So now I've got two of those models. And just for sake of distinguishing them, I'm going to change the color on one of them. So now you see I've got a second model here. I like to keep, one model that still has the tooth present that I can position an implant off of, but I need to create a second model that has that tooth removed. So after hiding this, I can go in now and I can virtually extract this tooth. All right, so we're in the surfaces panel. I'm going to zoom way in here and I'm going to cut out that tooth. So notice that my cut tool is grayed out. Why is that? Because right now I've got the blue model selected and it's actually the green model I want to work on. So you've got to select the correct model up here. When I click on the green model, it's highlighted. Now the cut tool becomes visible and I can just use this tool and cut out that tooth. All right, now there's numerous ways that we could approach this and I'll show you a couple of them. All right, remember, deactivate that tool. And I have cut that tooth out. All right, now it is important when you're cutting a tooth, you want to do that from the lingual. Why? Because let me show you here. Let's say that I was to, want to cut a little bit more off that tooth. If I go to cut and I try to get that last little bit, look at what happens. That cut tool cuts indefinitely, through space. So anything that's behind the area that you're cutting on is also going to be cut. Well, I don't want to do that. So I could either click this back arrow and undo it, or just Control Z on your keyboard and that will undo that. All right. So that would probably work right there. Now you might have noticed it gave me a little warning. It said mesh cut failure, and that will oftentimes happen when you're cutting. And what it's telling you is there was these two little areas that it couldn't completely close the mesh, and that's fine. We could fix that. If you wanted to fix that little hole, we could go to Model Manipulation Panel. So it's tabbed over here, or I could go to Panels, Model Manipulation. All right. And let's say I just want to close this model back up. Click on Close Model. So not only is it going to repair those holes, it's going to generate a base on this model. All right, so now in my surfaces panel, I've got not only the blue and green, but I've got this new yellow model. And it has closed in those surfaces where the holes were. And we could now build a guide on this. Now let me undo that. And let me show you another option. So going back to the panels up here, to the modules up here, if I went back to Model Master, okay, I've got some, finer control tools that I could use here. So you'll only find these functions in the Model Master. Remember, that's where we do model work. If I go to Panels and I go to Model Edit, you can see here that I've got selection brushes, I've got brush tools, I've got hole closing functionality, lots of cool things that I could use here. So for an example, I could use this selection brush, but remember, you've got to tell it what model you're working on. Right now, it's set to work on this blue model. Well, that's not the one I want to work on. So just click up here, work on your green model in this case, and let's turn on the selection brush. All right, so I've got a little bit finer control here. If I hold down Shift on my keyboard, you see a brush tool comes up. All right, and that brush tool is what I'm going to use to brush in the areas that I want to cut out. All right, so it's not such an indiscriminate tool as the cut function. So I could go and perfectly trace out the gingival margin of this tooth, and anywhere that I want to cut, I just hold down Shift. If I let go of Shift, I can just move the model around, do whatever I want, and then when I hold Shift, turns on the tool and I can select. All right, I can increase the brush size. So now I've got a bigger brush. I can go bigger still. So I'm going to just brush in this whole tooth that I'm wanting to virtually extract. All right, so I've got all of that tooth selected, and now I could tell it cut out that selected area. So now you see that we've got just a big hole. Now you do have to have a solid model to build a guide on, at least on the surfaces where the guide will sit. So I can close holes. So let's come up here and let's say select holes manually. So it's going to throw a yellow boundary around each hole in the case. Now obviously the bottom side of this model is completely open, so that's one hole, but then the hole I'm actually concerned with is this one where I cut the tooth out. We could close selected holes. All right, so if I just wanted to repair everything, I could say close all these holes. If I want to close selected holes, then I can just click on the boundary of that individual hole. All right, so when I click on it, it turns red and say close select holes. And now it has filled that in. But let's say that we wanted, to have the gingiva go down more where it looks, more like an ovate pontic site, let's say. You've got brush tools down here. Local deform brush, what is that? All right, hold down shift. If I use my scroll ball, I can increase the size of this tool. And the reason that's useful is I can now just orient this thing, and holding my left mouse button, I can pull this down. All right, and I can do this in multiple places. And I'd like the tool to be a little bit bigger, but that's okay. We can do this in numerous ways. All right, now obviously that's a very rough surface. You've got smoothing brushes. If I wanted to make my tool smaller, either use the slider or hold your shift button. So if I'm trying to smooth an area right here without altering that tooth, I can do it with a little bit finer control. All right, and then you've got add and remove. Okay, so if I click that button and I hold shift, that's going to be an add tool. All right, let's control Z that. If I have the control button, that's going to be a remove tool. All right, so I probably want to use like a large diameter here, and I don't need the tool to be super strong. If I wanted to, make this a little bit more ovate, I'm going to just hold down my control button, and I can manually make this go down in areas and take away from the model. And you could brush that into wherever you feel like it would be appropriate for this particular site. Now, it's not critical that I be perfect on this. I'm just going to get it where the tooth looks like it's removed, and the gingiva is not sitting up way too high. All right, so we've pretty much got rid of that tooth. And now this would be a model that we could proceed with planning a immediate implant for this site. So you've got either option. You could just simply cut it and that will work. Close your model if you just want to do it quick and dirty. If you're trying to have really fine control, you can do it this way. You've got even options in the Model Master module here. We could even, for example, go to the segmentation panel. We could actually segment that individual root out in its exact anatomy and then subtract that from this model where you had a truly anatomic socket there. I choose to do it this way most of the time. I think this is the simple, clean, easy way to do it. But anyway, once you've got a model that you are comfortable to make your immediate guide on, then we need to go back to advanced mode. All right, we've already planned that first implant, and looking back at our cheat sheet, I didn't mention it previously, but once you've planned your tooth, you always want to lock it. And then the same thing with your implant. Once you've planned your implant, you want to lock that. So for example, coming up here, if I was to right click on my tooth, just a right click, you would see the option to lock the tooth. And the reason you want to do that is when you've got that where you want it and you're happy with it, you don't want to accidentally grab this widget and knock it out of position and then kind of screw your planning up. The same goes for your implant. In any window, if I right click on that implant, I can lock it. That way, I'm not going to accidentally grab a widget and screw up my positioning. All right, so we need to plan this immediate implant. Notice here that now I've got both model outlines, right? You can see my original blue model, which has the tooth present. And if I was to turn that off and maybe just look at the hint, I can see where that tooth is in its outline. And that way I can use the crown for positioning. So let's do another implant. I would guess for a premolar, probably a 4.3 by, let's say, 13 millimeter implant. All right, click OK. Wherever you click next is where it's going to drop the implant. Use any window that you want. But again, for your fine positioning, I would highly suggest that you just use this tangential window. All right, so I can look at it in cross section. And I would like to come right through the occlusal surface. I would probably be about, for an immediate, I'd go about 1.5 millimeters subcrestal. Looks like we've got plenty of room. We're not close to the nerve. All right, and then we want to make sure we're coming through the long axis of that tooth. Remember, evaluate your prosthetic emergence. If you want to, turn that model back on. You can see exactly where you're coming through. And you know, maybe I want to tilt this a little bit more occlusally, or I'm sorry, to the buccal. So we could go with that. That would probably work. You do have an exclamation point. Why is it doing that? Well, again, it's noticing that, hey, that implant is pretty deep. Your guide tube might be impinging into your STL model here. And it'll give you the option. Do you want to raise that tube up? If you do, you know, it'll tell you to compensate by using this drill or that. But again, I'm gonna flap usually. I'm gonna have you know, open tissue, so I'm not terribly concerned with that. I'll generally just turn those warnings off. But the warnings I do always want. I want to make sure I keep implants 3 millimeters apart. I want to stay 2 millimeters from the nerve. The angle, if you're getting an angle violation between two implants, you know, for two individual implants, it might be irrelevant to me. So I might just make this a big number, 50 degrees or something, so I wouldn't get a warning. And then your software guide tube collision allowance, since I'm going to flap, I always have that, you know, at a big number like 4. But now we can see where this implant is positioned for a proposed immediate. All right. And one other thing I'll point out on your models, if I go in the surfaces panel, you do have a transparency slider. So if you're trying to see underneath a model, it might be useful to have that transparency turned on, because sometimes your widgets, you know, you might not be able to see whatever particular thing you're wanting to mess with. So I like this. I think this looks good. Once you like that, we didn't have to plan a tooth here because we already had a tooth, but I've planned my implant. I do want to now lock that. All right. So at this point, my tooth has served its purpose. I don't really need to see that anymore. So you have buttons up here for simply the visibility. So for example, this tooth, if I wanted to turn the visibility off, I can just hit hide teeth. All right. And that doesn't delete it, it just hides it. All right. And now we would be ready to make the guide, but there's an important thing that we need to do before we do that. Look back at your cheat sheet. You need to choose the surgical kit and you need to turn on the guide tube. Again, if you think in the wizard, you did that automatically right at the start of the case. It asked you the kit you were using. Here, it's not going to automatically prompt you, so we need to go to Panels, Implant List, and tell it we're going to use this fully guided Blue Sky Bio keyless surgical kit. But then also you've got to turn on your guide tube. So over here for each of my implants, you can see there is a visibility check for each implant. There is the abutment, and then there's the guide tube. You need to check that on. You've got to be able to see your guide tubes present. If you went ahead and designed this guide and didn't have tubes visible, you would simply get a night guard. That's all you're going to get because it doesn't have any tubes showing. All right, now it's always a question from people, hey, this is impinging into the model. Is that going to be a problem? And the answer is, as long as the adjacent teeth are not impinging into this internal diameter of your guide tube, it'll be fine. All right, that's not a problem. The software knows it can't do that. It's going to trim this way. You really need to think of this more as a plastic tube. This is not necessarily the metal guide sleeve. All right, and then let me point out one other thing you might want to use advanced mode for. This is a case that we're going to use the keyless guided surgery kit. If you look at the keyless guided surgery drills, there's no cutting portion of that drill that comes in contact with the guide. And so it does beg the question, do I really need a metal guide sleeve? And honestly, in most cases, if I'm using a keyless kit, I would say that the metal sleeve doesn't really add much value to the case. So I like to change my settings so that I don't have to use a metal sleeve. Now, when I've chosen this kit, Blue Sky is going to automatically default the size of this guide tube, but it's going to, remember, this is the plastic. It's going to size that to the size that you would need it to be to then insert a metal sleeve. All right, well, if I want to use the guide without a metal sleeve, then this hole is going to be too big. So if you take measurements on the Blue Sky Bio fully guided kit and you measure the diameter of that built-in key, it's going to be about 5 millimeters. All right, so if I wanted to modify this guide so that I didn't have to use sleeves, what I could simply do is come down here, and since that's 5 millimeters, I need it to be slightly bigger. I found for my printer about 0.15 bigger than the part I'm guiding. So instead of having the guide hole diameter set here, which is for a metal sleeve, I could just change this to 5.15. It's going to give you a warning that you're deviating from the proposed settings, and we know that it is. That's why we're doing this. I'll generally make my tube height be like 5 because ultimately it's going to get trimmed wherever it hits this model. But then your offset, the offset for the Blue Sky Bio fully guided kit, every drill in the kit is designed to work with an 8.5 millimeter offset. So why did it automatically propose 8? Well, because it's planning this for a metal sleeve, and that metal sleeve adds that last ½ millimeter of height to get your 8.5 offset. And offset is simply the distance from platform of your implant to the top of this guide tube. So just imagine here, if you stuck in a metal sleeve that had a ½ millimeter lip, that would give you the correct offset from platform to the top of 8.5. Well, if I'm not going to use a metal sleeve, then I need to manually change that to 8.5. All right. And so by changing those settings, it's only applied it to the implant I was working on. Now I could click on this implant now and do the same settings, or I could simply click apply to all. Now watch the molar implant. You see I just changed the settings because they're going to be the exact same for both sides. So that's a good example of something that you could do in advanced mode that you can't do in the wizard. You couldn't do the model editing for an immediate. You couldn't do the manual tube settings either. So now we're ready to make a guide. We've turned on our tubes. We've set them correctly. We've told it the kit we're using. Now we would need to go to Panels, Guide Fabrication. All right. Now remember, we've got multiple STLs here in the case, so it's critical that we tell it which model we're building this guide on. It's a mandible, and we want to build it on this green case 1 gingiva model. All right. If that was incorrect, click on the drop-down menu and change to the correct model. All right. Always lock your implants in virtual teeth. Always use the automatic brush. I can think of very few exceptions to that. You don't need to change this, leave that the same. always use normal quality. There's no value in going higher. And then, you've got some more versatility here. In the wizard mode, your path of insertion for this guide seat is just going to be from straight above, right? It's going to go straight down onto this mandible. I could here, if I wanted to, indicate my own unique path of draw. So let's say if I wanted to come in at a very specific angle right here, I could indicate that as my path of draw. Now I'm not going to do that. That's not really a big deal for this case. We're ready to draw the curve, right? The curve is your guide outline. And again, I could click on draw curve and I could do this manually. All right, if I hold shift, I can begin dropping points and I could indicate a very specific curve. But you've also got the automated function, so click on automatic curve. And here you see it has automatically generated that. So just a little time saver, it's going to automatically do that for you. If you want to reposition any nodes, feel free to grab any of the nodes and reposition them to wherever you would like. And then once again, looking at your cheat sheet, you could go ahead and create the guide, but if you want windows, you're going to have to add the windows at this step. All right, so I'm going to right click the model, add a window. The same widget pops up. Wherever I have this positioned is where it's going to cut out a window to verify my seating. So I'm only looking to expose some cusp tips. So position these wherever you want. You don't need a ton of them. And remember, in the wizard mode, you're going to, by default, end up with a couple of windows right next to each implant site on the proximal teeth. That's a function of this automatic brush. That is where it's clearing out a 15mm perimeter for your handpiece head to go. And by default, that generally means it's going to create a few windows there. So I'm kind of mindful of that as I'm positioning these. I'm going to get a window here, 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 and then I've added two more. That is plenty enough windows for this case. I don't see any reason to do more than that. So we've got windows positioned. Remember, don't have them down here by your boundary. That'll make your guide thin. We're pretty much ready to create the surgical guide. So let's hit create surgical guide. And here is our guide that's been created. All right. Now, a cool feature you could do here that you can't do in the wizard mode is, you see down here there's a text tool. I could emboss text on this. So if you planned this guide 2 weeks ago and you've got multiple cases coming up, you might in your lab have several guides sitting around for upcoming cases, and it can become a little confusing as to whose is whose. So this text tool, you can add text, and the text stays stationary. It's however you position the model behind it will tell you how it's going to apply that text. So if I wanted to put my initials right here, make them kind of big where they're visible, and then always check this. Remember, it's only going to apply text to the model that is selected up here. And I see all the time in courses where people keep applying text and they're like, man, it's not showing up. And then you go and look and it's on the gingiva. And when they turn their guide off, they can see they've got their initials 100 times on the model. So make sure that you're applying it to your guide. And then you can engrave or emboss this. I like to engrave them. Apply the text. And you notice here it has engraved my initials into that. That way it's going to be easy to keep track of when I go to find this case on the day I'm going to do it. All right, so at this point we are ready to finish this case up. We need to export this guide so that we can actually 3D print it or send it for 3D printing. So again, unlike the wizard where it prompts you, you need to just go do this step. That's why the cheat sheet's so useful. Go to File, Export Data. Now when I click that, you see all these check boxes. All right. Why are all these checked on? Well, let me cancel this for a second. Because whatever you have visible on the screen is going to be defaulted on to be exported. And Blue Sky Plan will allow you to export the nerve, the jawbone, the implants, the abutments, the tubes, the guide, your STL models. So really all I want to export here is this surgical guide. So I could either hide everything here. So let's just use the nerves, for example. If I hide those nerves, they're not going to be defaulted on as visible or as something you want to export now that I've turned them off. And let's do the same for the implants. Let's hide those. But because my green model is still visible, you'll see it's checked on. So File, Export Data. Remember, I don't want to export that model. I only want this guide with windows. Okay, so I can now click Export. It's going to tell you you've got so many exports remaining. When I click this, now I have exported from this case before, so it's not telling me that it's going to deduct an export, but that's because I've done this case 100 times. Generally, it's going to say this will deduct one export. Are you sure you want to proceed? Yes. Click OK. And you're only going to pay a maximum of one export per case. So if I designed, let's say in the same case, I designed another guide for the opposing side or for the maxilla, I'm still only going to get one export charged. Or maybe I reopen this case and I change it to a different kit or an implant. Again, it's the same case, so I'm not going to get deducted another export. So let's save this as case 1 surgical guide. Now that's saved to my downloads. Remember, it also is useful to create that drill report. So let's go to File, Drill Report. All right, it auto generates a bunch of snapshots of the various implant positions. But just so you see this, suppose there was something in particular that I wanted to remember. All right, let's just make something up here. I wanted to remember this particular screenshot of the distance of that implant to this nerve. Every window has this little button 3 down called screenshot. All right, when I click that, it's going to add a new file into this screenshot. All right, and so that would get added to my drill report. All right, so once again, I'll go to File, Drill Report, and you'll see that that new image is right here because I've added it to the screenshots for my drill report. Let's click PDF. If you wanted to make yourself some notes about, hey, this patient's on blood thinners or whatever, you can write yourself some notes there. Choose the setup of how you want this, how many images per page. Do you want them all in one page? It's up to you. And then all this other stuff. You can put as many notes into this as you want, but when you click OK, it's going to generate that drill report. All right, and then I could save this. I'll save it in my downloads as case 1 drill report. And then the last thing that you always have to do, this is so critically important, is you've got to save your case. All right, so, and I would even suggest if it's early on in your planning, if I was really doing this case, it would take me 5 minutes, and I've not lost that much if my computer dies or it crashes or something like that. But early on, there's nothing more sickening than being working and you spend all this time trying to learn this, and then your computer crashes and you lose it all. So just periodically save your case. All right, you can go up here to Save Project As, and I'm going to save it in my downloads, and I'm going to call this Case 1 Final Plan. All right. And you do always, if I was working along saving as I go, I could just click this, it would save it. Click it again, it would save it. But I like to save it at the very end so that I know the guide that I have in hand correlates to this plan. So I'll label it final. So now I have my case saved, I have my guide, I have a drill report, I've got everything I need. Let's just to show you some more functionality, let's suppose I wanted to have a working model that I could try the guide in on. All right, I don't generally do this, but I'm just trying to show you different functions. All right, here is that model. Remember, you can't use it on the blue model because that tooth is still present. But suppose I wanted to actually be able to 3D print this model. All right. If I go back to Model Manipulation Panel, I could say generate me a hollow model. All right. Closed model is just going to add a base, close holes, but it's going to all be a solid model, and that'll be pricey to print because it's a lot of resin. Whereas if I say hollow model, you see how new STL has been generated? And let's look at this. It's added a base, it's created this cross-hatched bottom so that resin can drain out, and it's hollowed it. This would be a much cheaper model to print. So I could now export that. And you wouldn't get deducted another export. We could call it case 1 model. And now we have that file. All right. So that's the end of this case. I could keep showing you all kinds of fancy stuff, but again, I'm mainly gearing this video towards getting you up and going on your routine implant cases. And so hopefully we covered a lot there, and the wizard, you should absolutely be able to make a guide your very first try. It is so simple to use. But even as you start advancing into a slightly more difficult case where you need to do an immediate, or you want to go sleeveless, or you want to generate these models, hopefully this video will serve as a tutorial for that. Again, if you look in the comments, there's going to be a link that has the files for this case, so you can download them and you can practice everything I've shown you in this video on your own time and get proficient with it, so that when you have your own case, hopefully you feel comfortable tackling that. So anyway, I hope you found that useful. If you're interested in courses or anything, go to my website at coryglenn.org, and I would love to see you there. We get into a lot more advanced stuff, cases of all types, edentulous, bone supported guides, plus just a lot of routine surgical implant knowledge. I mean, we really get deep in the courses, so there's a basic and an advanced, and then I'm working very soon on scheduling some digital full mouth rehab courses, as well as digital denture courses. So if you're interested in any of those, be checking the website. And again, hope you found that helpful. We'll see you next time.